Hello, everyone. I'm your sleep sinners for tonight, here to guide you into a peaceful and mysterious slumber. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. Go ahead, get comfortable, relax, and let the rain and stories take you away. Chants at Tiger's Nest, Bhutan. Chapter 1. The Call. The monk's warning still echoed in Tashi's ears as he stood at the edge of the precipice. The infamous Tiger's Nest monastery clinging to the cliff face like a desperate man's last hope. The monastery reveals different faces to different souls. His phone had died hours ago. Not that there was reception up here anyway. And the setting sun painted the Himalayan peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Below him, clouds swirled in the valley like ghosts searching for their way home. Well, this is definitely not in the travel brochure, Tashi muttered, adjusting the straps of his backpack. 24 hours ago, he'd been doom scrolling through his social feeds in his San Francisco apartment, trying to ignore the 37 unread emails from his thesis advisor. Now, he stood at the threshold of Bhutan's most sacred monastery, about to spend the night where few foreigners had ever been allowed to stay. The invitation had come from his grandfather's old friend, a senior monk named Rinchen, who had written a cryptic letter speaking of ancestral connections that require attention. Tashi had almost ignored it. He hadn't been back to his parents' homeland since he was 8, but something about the handwritten pages had pulled at him. That, and the crushing weight of his unfinished anthropology dissertation on modern spiritual practices in the digital age. What better research than first-hand experience? A cold wind whipped to the prayer flags strung across the narrow path, their colorful rectangles snapping like hands clapping in the thin mountain air. Tashi pulled his jacket tighter and stepped forward. "You must be Wong Chuk's grandson," a voice called from the monastery entrance. An elderly monk with skin like weathered leather and eyes bright with intelligence stood framed by the ornate doorway. "I am Rinchen." Tashi bowed awkwardly. "Thank you for inviting me, Rinchen La." The old monk studied him with an intensity that made Tashi want to check if his face was dirty. "You have your grandfather's eyes. Come, before the light fades completely." Inside, the monastery was a maze of corridors, prayer halls, and small chambers carved directly into the mountainside. The scent of butter lamps and incense hung heavy in the air. Somewhere, water dripped in a steady rhythm like a meditation timer. Rinchen led him through a series of increasingly narrow passages until they reached a small room with a window overlooking the valley. "This will be your quarters," Rinchen said. "You should rest. The altitude affects even those with Bhutanese blood." Tashi nodded gratefully, already feeling light-headed from the thin air. "Rinchen La, my grandfather never spoke much about his time here. He said this place was special, but you wonder why we have invited you," Rinchen finished. "All will become clear during your stay. For now, know only that Paro Taksang, what you call Tiger's Nest, sits at the boundary between worlds. Here, the past and present flow together like tributary streams into a river." "I'm not sure I understand," Tashi admitted. The old monk smiled. "Understanding is not required, only presence." He gestured to a small altar in the corner of the room. "We gather for evening prayers at sunset. Until then, settle your mind." After Rinchen left, Tashi unpacked his minimal belongings and sat cross-legged on a thin bed mat. The silence in the monastery was unlike any he'd experienced before, not the absence of sound, but something alive with presence. Occasionally, he caught snippets of chanting from distant chambers, voices rising and falling like the mountain wind. He must have dozed off, because a soft knocking jolted him awake. When he opened the door, there was no one there, just a corridor lit by butter lamps that flickered as if someone had just passed by. The sound of prayer wheels spinning drew him forward. "Hello," Tashi called out, his voice sounding small in the ancient hallway. No answer came, but the spinning sound continued, pulling him deeper into the monastery. He followed it to a heavy wooden door, carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Without thinking, he pushed it open. Inside, the room was circular and windowless, lit only by a single butter lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. Prayer wheels lined the perimeter, but they were still. No one else was there. Yet the spinning sound continued, now seeming to come from behind a tapestry depicting a wrathful deity with multiple arms. Tashi approached cautiously and lifted the edge of the fabric. Beyond it was not another room, but what appeared to be a narrow tunnel carved into the rock. The sound was clearer now, the unmistakable wooden clatter of prayer wheels in motion, along with low, rhythmic chanting. "This can't be right," Tashi whispered, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight, forgetting momentarily that it was dead. When he looked up again, a figure stood at the mouth of the tunnel, a monk with his hood pulled low, obscuring his face. "I'm sorry, I got lost," Tashi began, but his words died in his throat as the figure raised its head. Where there should have been a face, there was only darkness, with 2 points of deeper black where eyes should be. The figure beckoned, then turned and disappeared into the tunnel. Heart pounding, Tashi backed away until he hit the opposite wall. The tapestry fell back into place, and suddenly the room seemed ordinary again, just an empty meditation chamber in an ancient monastery. He nearly ran back to his room, then sat on his bed with his hands trembling. Had altitude sickness caused him to hallucinate, or had he simply seen a monk with his face shadowed by his hood? When the gong sounded for evening prayers, Tashi hesitated before leaving his room. As he made his way to the main prayer hall, he noticed a young monk about his own age arranging cushions. "Excuse me," Tashi said, "is there a section of the monastery with a circular room, behind a tapestry?" The young monk looked puzzled. "There are many prayer rooms, but no passages behind tapestries that I know of. I am Dorji, by the way. You must be the American scholar Rinchen-La mentioned." "Tashi, and I'm only half American. My father is from Thimphu." Dorji nodded. "It is good you have returned. Some say the monastery has been waiting for you." "Waiting for me? What does that mean?" But more monks were entering now, including Rinchen, who motioned for Tashi to sit beside him. As the chanting began, Tashi tried to focus, but his thoughts kept returning to the tunnel and the faceless monk. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear the clicking of prayer wheels from somewhere deep within the mountain, a sound that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. After prayers, as the monks filed out, Rinchen placed a hand on Tashi's shoulder. "You seem troubled." Tashi hesitated, then described what he had seen. Instead of dismissing him, Rinchen looked grave. "The monastery reveals different faces to different souls," he repeated his earlier warning. "What you saw was not meant for ordinary eyes." "But what was it? Who was that person?" "Not all who dwell in Paro Taxang are visible to everyone," Rinchen said. "Some are guardians of knowledge that passes from one generation to the next. Your grandfather was a keeper of such knowledge before he left for America." Tashi shook his head. "My grandfather was an engineer. He designed bridges. He built bridges of many kinds." Rinchen agreed cryptically. "Tomorrow we will speak more. Tonight, lock your door and do not wander, no matter what you hear." Back in his room, Tashi did as instructed, wedging his backpack against the door for good measure. He tried to distract himself by reviewing his research notes, but the monastery's silence seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical force. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, a sound jerked him fully awake. The same wooden clatter of prayer wheels he'd heard earlier, now seeming to come from directly outside his door. Then a voice, barely above a whisper. Tashi Wongchuk, the path is opening. You must follow. He sat frozen on his bed mat, watching as a shadow of feet appeared in the gap beneath his door. The handle turned, testing the lock. Who's there? Tashi called, his voice cracking. No answer came, but the shadow remained. Then, slowly it lowered as if whoever or whatever was outside had knelt down. A folded piece of paper slid under the door. Tashi waited until the shadow disappeared before retrieving it with shaking hands. Written in elegant script was a single sentence. To find what was lost, follow the sound of the wheels when the moon touches the western peak. Outside his window, the waning moon was just beginning to align with the jagged mountain silhouette. And somewhere in the depths of the monastery, the prayer wheels continued their relentless spinning, calling to him with each revolution. Chapter 2, The Descent. Dawn broke over Tiger's Nest like a fever dream, mist curling around the monastery's tiered roofs, prayer flags snapping in the wind, and the distant call of ravens echoing across the valley. Tashi had barely slept. The note lay on the floor where he dropped it after reading it for the 20th time. Its cryptic message burned into his memory. Breakfast was a silent affair in the monastery's communal kitchen. Sampa porridge with butter tea that tasted better than Tashi had expected. The young monk, Dorji, sat beside him while older monks moved about like ghosts, their maroon robes brushing the stone floor. Did you sleep well? Dorji asked, his voice low. Tashi hesitated. Not really. Is it normal to hear things at night here? Like prayer wheels spinning when no one's around. Dorji's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. The monastery speaks in many ways, but not everyone can hear its voice. He leaned closer. They say you are descended from the Black Hat lineage. Is this true? The what? No, my grandfather was just a regular guy who left Bhutan in the 70s. Nothing special. Dorji looked unconvinced. Perhaps you should ask Rinchinla about your family history. There are no coincidences in Paro Taksang. After breakfast, Tashi found Rinchin in a small garden terrace carved into the cliffside. Bees buzzed lazily among alpine flowers that seemed too delicate for their harsh surroundings. The old monk was feeding chickadees from his palm, the tiny birds landing and taking off like thoughts materializing and dissolving. You received a message, Rinchin said without turning around. It wasn't a question. Tashi pulled the note from his pocket. How did you know? The monastery has been waiting for this moment. Rinchin finally turned, his eyes reflecting the clear mountain sky. Your grandfather was more than an engineer, Tashi. He was a lineage holder, one tasked with protecting knowledge too dangerous to be written down. What kind of knowledge? A method of traversing, a way of moving between realities. Rinchin scattered the remaining seeds, and the birds dispersed like whispers. The Black Hat sect has guarded this knowledge for centuries. It is not magic as Westerners understand it, but profound comprehension of reality's true nature. Tashi's anthropology training kicked in, recognizing the pattern of an esoteric tradition with initiation rites and hidden knowledge. But another part of him, the part raised on his grandfather's bedtime stories about mountains that walked and tigers that spoke, felt a shiver of recognition. When my grandfather left Bhutan, he was supposed to pass this knowledge to someone else? Rinchin nodded, but he did not. He believed the knowledge should die with him, that humanity was not ready. Yet the knowledge itself has other ideas. It seeks continuation, like water finding a path downhill. And you think it's, what? Calling to me? Tashi couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. I think you would not have seen what you saw if that were not the case. Rinchin gestured toward the monastery's inner sanctum. Come, there is something you should see. They walked through corridors Tashi hadn't explored yet, descending deeper into the cliff face. The air grew cooler, the stone walls more ancient. Finally, they reached a small door reinforced with iron bands. This chamber houses our most sacred texts, Rinchen explained, producing an ornate key, including records of your family line. Inside, the room was surprisingly modest. Simple wooden shelves holding cloth-wrapped bundles and scroll cases. Rinchen selected one and carefully unrolled on a table. It showed a family tree written in classical Dzonka, with red lines connecting certain names. Here, Rinchen pointed to a name near the bottom, Wangchuk Dorji, your grandfather, and above him, 15 generations of lineage holders, back to the founder of the Black Hat tradition. Tashi stared at the document, noting the empty space below his grandfather's name. But my father isn't listed, or me. The lineage is not always passed from father to son. It follows its own path. Rinchen rolled up the scroll. Your grandfather fled his responsibility, but the knowledge cannot remain dormant forever. Now it calls to you. Through faceless monks and spinning prayer wheels? Tashi shook his head. With all due respect, Rinchen La, this sounds impossible? So is a monastery built on a vertical cliff face. Yet here we stand. Rinchen replaced the scroll and locked the door. Tonight, when the moon touches the western peak, you must make your choice. Follow the sound of the wheels, or walk away from your heritage forever. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Tashi joined the monks for their midday rituals. Try to focus on the chanting and prostrations while his mind raced. He kept thinking about his grandfather, the gentleman who had taught him to fly kites and solve equations, who had never once mentioned being part of an ancient mystical lineage. In the afternoon, he hiked down to a small promontory overlooking the valley. His phone had revived enough for him to check the time, but there was still no signal. No way to Google Black Hat sect or text his roommate about the bizarre turn his research trip had taken. The monks say you're special. The voice startled him. A young woman in hiking gear stood a few feet away, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. I'm Deki, by the way. My father is the caretaker of the lower shrine. Tashi. And I'm not special, just confused. She sat beside him on the rocky outcrop. First time at Tiger's Nest? First time in Bhutan since I was a kid. My parents moved to California when I was 8. Deki nodded. But something brought you back. Research for my dissertation, and a weird invitation. Tashi hesitated, then asked, Have you ever heard of the Black Hat lineage? A shadow seemed to cross her face. Everyone in Paro knows the stories. They say the Black Hats can walk through walls and speak with the dead. That's not exactly what Rinchen told me. Rinchen is bound by vows of secrecy. Deki picked up a small stone and tossed it over the edge, watching it disappear into the clouds below. But my grandmother was a storyteller. She said the Black Hats guard doorways between worlds, and that Tiger's Nest was built with a veil as thinnest. Tashi thought about the tunnel behind the tapestry, and the faceless monk. Do you believe these stories? I believe this mountain has secrets. She stood, brushing dust from her pants. And I believe some mysteries should remain mysteries. Be careful, Tashi from California. Not all who hear the monastery's call return from answering it. Before he could ask what she meant, Deki was already walking away, her figure soon swallowed by the mist that had begun crawling up the mountainside. That evening, tension hung in the air like the approach of storm. The monks were more withdrawn during dinner, speaking in hushed tones that fell silent whenever Tashi came near. Even Dorji avoided his gaze. Only Rinchen seemed unchanged, his serene demeanor a counterpoint to the monastery's growing unease. After the evening meditation, he handed Tashi a small cloth bag, dried apples and sampa, in case your journey is longer than expected. Tashi took the bag automatically. You really think I should follow this, whatever it is? I think some questions can only be answered by asking them. Rinchin's weathered face creased in a smile. Your grandfather once stood where you stand now. He chose to run from his destiny. Perhaps you will make a different choice. Back in his room, Tashi paced the floor, watching the moon's progress across the sky through his narrow window. The note had said to follow the sound of the wheels when the moon touched the western peak. But was he really considering this? Following mysterious sounds into hidden tunnels in a cliffside monastery? His academic mind wanted to rationalize everything. Stress, altitude sickness, the power of suggestion. But another part of him, a part that felt increasingly at home in this ancient place, whispered that some truths couldn't be found in textbooks or research papers. The moon inched closer to the jagged western peak. Tashi packed his bag with essentials, water, the food Rinchin had given him, his phone useless as it was, and a small flashlight. As the silvery light aligned perfectly with the mountain's highest point, he heard it. The now familiar wooden clatter of prayer wheels in motion. This time, it seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the stone walls like the monastery itself was one giant instrument. Tashi opened his door cautiously. The corridor was empty, lit only by butter lamps that cast dancing shadows. The sound led him deeper into the complex, past the main prayer hall, and into areas he hadn't seen before. Eventually, he found himself in the circular room from the previous day. The tapestry depicting the wrathful deity seemed to undulate in the dim light, though there was no breeze. The spinning sound was unmistakably coming from behind it. Tashi approached slowly, half expecting to see the faceless monk waiting for him. Instead, when he lifted the edge of the heavy fabric, he found only the tunnel mouth, dark and uninviting. "This is crazy," he muttered, but switched on his flashlight and ducked into the passage. The tunnel was narrow but tall enough that he didn't need to stoop. It wound downward in a gentle spiral, the walls smooth as if worn by centuries of passing hands. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a mineral scent like wet stone after rain. After what felt like an eternity of descent, the tunnel opened into a large cavern. Tashi's flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, giving the unsettling impression of infinite space. In the center stood a circle of prayer wheels, large ones, taller than a man, mounted on wooden poles. They were spinning slowly, though there was no one turning them. As Tashi approached, he saw that the wheels were inscribed not with the usual mantras, but with symbols he'd never seen before, more complex, more angular. They seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them, like trying to read underwater. "Hello." His voice echoed strangely, as if the cavern were both vast and intimate at the same time. "Is anyone here?" "We have always been here." The voice came from behind him. Tashi whirled around to find three figures in the traditional black robes and distinctive black hats of the Karmakagi lineage. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their eyes reflected his flashlight beam like animals' eyes in the dark. "You are late. Tashi Wongchuk," said the central figure, taller than the others. "The wheels have been turning for you since your birth." "Who are you? What is this place?" "We are the keepers. This place is a nexus, one of the few points where worlds touch." The figure gestured toward the spinning prayer wheels. "These are not for prayer, but for passage." The tallest keeper stepped closer, and Tashi fought the urge to retreat. "Your grandfather abandoned his post, leaving the door unguarded. Now, entities slip through unbidden. The balance must be restored." "Entities?" Like what happened with the faceless monk. Tashi's scientific mind was struggling to process what he was hearing. "That was merely a guardian, testing your awareness," said the second keeper, voice higher and possibly female. "The true travelers are more consequential." As if on cue, the prayer wheels began to spin faster, their wooden parts creating a sound like rushing water. The air in the center of the circle seemed to thicken, becoming opalescent, then transparent in a way that suggested depth rather than emptiness. "What you see before you is a door," explained the third keeper, one of 7 throughout the world. "Without proper guidance, they become unstable." Tashi watched in fascination and terror as the space between the wheels continued to change, now resembling the surface of water viewed from below. A liquid window through which dim shapes could be seen moving. "This is why you were called," said the tall keeper. "The lineage must continue. Someone must learn to guide travelers safely between worlds and maintain the barrier that prevents unauthorized crossings. And if I refuse?" Tashi asked, finally finding his voice. The 3 keepers exchanged glances. "Then the door will eventually fail. The consequences would be unpredictable." "You mean dangerous?" "Reality is a consensus," Tashi Wongchuk. "When too many contradictory versions overlap, the consensus breaks down. The central prayer will suddenly spun violently in the portal, because Tashi can no longer deny that's what it was. Pulse with blue light. Through it, he briefly glimpsed what appeared to be another cavern, but with crystal formations and hooded figures gathered in a circle. "Something is coming through," hissed the female keeper. "Unauthorized." The 3 keepers moved with surprising speed, positioning themselves around the portal. They began chanting in unison, their hands weaving complex patterns in the air. The portal's edges, which had begun to fray like cloth unraveling, slowly stabilized. "We cannot hold it indefinitely," the tall keeper called to Tashi. "You must decide. Accept your heritage and begin your training, or leave now and never return." Tashi stood frozen, his academic certainties crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. Yet something deeper than doubt held him back. Fear of disappearing into this hidden world, of becoming like these enigmatic keepers with their shadowed faces and arcane knowledge. Then he remembered his grandfather's eyes the few times he'd spoken of Bhutan, not with nostalgia, but with a weight that Tashi had never understood until now. He'd been carrying this secret his entire life. "What exactly would I have to do?" Tashi asked, taking a step toward the circle. The tall keeper's voice softened slightly. "Learn the old ways, master the signs and symbols, understand the nature of the doorways and those who use them, and spend my life in this cave? No, the training takes place here, but afterwards you will return to your world, keeping watch for signs of instability, living your life, but with additional responsibilities." The portal pulsed again, and this time Tashi caught a glimpse of a face pressing against the other side, not human, but not entirely alien either, with 2 large eyes and skin like polished obsidian. The female keeper grunted with effort as she reinforced her section of the barrier. "Decide quickly, Tashi Wongchuk. The door weakens." Tashi closed his eyes, searching for clarity. He thought of his life in San Francisco, his cramped apartment, his unfinished dissertation, his dating app profile that he hadn't updated in months. And he thought of his grandfather, who had turned his back on all this and spent decades looking over his shoulder. Perhaps running away wasn't the answer. Perhaps some doors couldn't be closed once they'd been opened. He opened his eyes and stepped forward. "I'll do it. Teach me." The relief was palpable in the keeper's postures. The tall one extended a hand. "Then take your place in the circle, initiate. Your first lesson begins now." As Tashi joined them around the portal, the prayer wheel spinning slowed to a steady rhythm, and the barrier between worlds solidified. The face on the other side withdrew, disappearing into its own reality. "Focus your mind on the center," instructed the female keeper. "Feel the flow of energies between the wheels." Tashi did as instructed, surprised to find that he could indeed sense something, a current like water or wind, but made of neither. It moved through the portal, through the wheels, through the keepers, and now, tentatively, through him. "The lineage remembers," murmured the third keeper approvingly. The knowledge is already within you, waiting to be awakened. As they continued their vigil, Tashi realized with start that he could now see the keepers' faces, ordinary human faces, neither monstrous nor divine, just people carrying an extraordinary burden. And now, for better or worse, that burden was also his. Chapter 3, The Return. 3 months later, Tashi stood at the monastery's outer gate, watching the sunrise paint the Himalayas in hues of amber and rose. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, lighter than when he'd arrived, but somehow feeling weightier with the knowledge it now contained. The morning bus to Paro leaves in 2 hours, said Dorji, who had become a friend during Tashi's unexpected extended stay. Are you certain you're ready to return? Tashi smiled. As ready as I'll ever be. The past months had transformed him in ways both visible and invisible. His body had grown leaner from the monastery's simple diet and daily physical training. His mind felt sharper, more focused, yet paradoxically more open to possibilities that would have seemed absurd to the academic who had first climbed a tiger's nest. Most significantly, he now understood what lay behind the tapestry in the circular room. Not just a physical cavern, but a nexus point where realities overlap like pages in a book. The Black Hat Keepers had taught him to read the signs of instability, to guide benign travelers safely through, and to reinforce the barriers against those who would cause harm. Your training is not complete, Rinchen reminded him as he joined them at the gate. This is merely the beginning of your journey. I know. 3 months every year, he said. Tashi adjusted his backpack. I'll be back after I finish my dissertation. Rinchen's weathered face creased in a smile. Your research has taken an interesting turn, I imagine. Tashi laughed. Yeah, my advisor's going to love my new chapter on interdimensional travel as metaphor in Bhutanese Buddhist practice. I'll have to be creative with my citations. What he couldn't include, of course, was what he'd seen in the cavern beneath Tiger's Nest. The portal spinning like liquid glass. The visitors from elsewhere with their impossible anatomies and strange requests. The delicate balance that the keepers maintained between worlds that were never meant to touch. Remember your exercises, the old monk instructed. The abilities you've begun to develop must be maintained, even in San Francisco. Tashi nodded, touching the small pouch hidden beneath his shirt. A protection amulet containing symbols similar to those on the great prayer wheels below. 15 minutes of meditation morning and night. Focus on the 7 points of contact. Record any anomalous dreams or sensations. And the emergency signal, should you encounter something beyond your current abilities to handle? Tashi traced a pattern in the air, invisible to ordinary eyes, but blazing beacon to those trained to see it. I remember they had explained that as a lineage heir beginning his training, he might unconsciously attract attention from being sensitive to such things. Most would be merely curious, but some might be dangerous. Until his training was complete, he was vulnerable. Deki appeared at the monastery gate, dressed in her usual practical hiking clothes. She had become a regular visitor during Tashi's training, bringing supplies from the village and news from the outside world. Ready for your return to modernity? She asked, falling into step beside him as they began the descent. Mostly, though I'm not looking forward to explaining to my department why I disappeared from communication for 3 months. Tell them you were on a spiritual retreat. It's not exactly a lie. They continued down the steep trail in comfortable silence. Unlike Tashi's ascent months earlier, the path now seemed familiar, almost welcoming. Prayer flags fluttered alongside them, sending blessings into the wind. Halfway down, they stopped at a small tea house perched on a ledge overlooking the valley. The proprietor, an elderly woman with beetle-stained teeth, served them butter tea and momos. I still can't believe all this was happening right under everyone's noses, Tashi said quietly, gesturing back toward the monastery. a doorway between worlds, and tourists just snap their photos and move on. Decky sipped her tea. People see what they expect to see. The truly extraordinary hides in plain sight. Like you? Tashi asked with a raised eyebrow. She smiled enigmatically. He had learned 2 weeks into his training that Decky was far more than the caretaker's daughter. She was a spotter, tasked with identifying potential threats or opportunities in the ordinary world. Her father had held the same role before her, and his father before him. "I prefer to think of myself as a useful friend," she replied. Speaking of which, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. A going-away present. Inside was a prayer wheel in miniature, perfectly crafted, with the same unusual symbols as the great wheels in Cavern, but sized to fit in his palm. "It's beautiful," Tashi said, turning it carefully. "It's functional," Decky corrected. "A detection tool. When active, it responds to ripples in the fabric between worlds. We spotters use them to identify potential breaches." Tashi stared at the gift with new appreciation. Such tools were rarely given to initiates at his level of training. "How does it work?" "Spin it counterclockwise while focusing on the central axis. If it grows warm or begins to spin on its own, something is nearby that shouldn't be." "Thank you. This will be helpful in San Francisco." Decky's expression grew serious. Urban centers often attract interdimensional anomalies. All those minds in proximity create a kind of psychic gravity. Be vigilant. They finished their meal and continued downward. As they neared the valley floor, the sounds of civilization grew stronger. Cars on a distant road, music from someone's portable speaker, tourists chattering in various languages as they began their ascent to the monastery. "Strange to think they have no idea," Tashi mused, watching a group of European hikers with expensive cameras and walking sticks. "Would you have believed it 3 months ago?" Decky asked. "Fair point." At the base of the trail, a small bus waited to take visitors back to Paro. Tashi hesitated before boarding. Turned to take one last look at tigers nest above them, impossibly clinging to the cliff face. "You know," he said to Decky, "my grandfather never told anyone about his connection to this place. He just walked away. And yet the lineage found you anyway," she pointed out. "Some paths can't be escaped, only postponed. I'm not trying to escape it. I just need to find a way to balance both worlds." "That is precisely what being a keeper is all about." She smiled and squeezed his arm. "Safe travels, Tashi Wongchuk, until your return." On the bus to Paro, Tashi watched the landscape transform from rugged mountains to terraced fields and finally to the small city with its distinctive architecture. His phone, charged at last, beeped continuously as 3 months of notifications flooded in. Emails from his advisor, texts from friends, news alerts about world events he'd missed entirely. None of it seemed quite real after what he'd experienced. How could he care about conference deadlines after seeing beings made of light and shadow step through a portal between worlds? How could faculty politics matter when he now knew the thin places where reality itself grew permeable? Yet this was a challenge the keepers had prepared him for, to live between worlds, to maintain the boundaries while moving freely across them, to be both scholar and guardian, Californian and Bhutanese, skeptic and believer. In Paro, he checked into a small hotel to adjust before his long flight back to the States. The hot shower, his first in months, felt miraculous, as did the soft bed and reliable electricity. He uploaded a carefully edited version of his experiences to his academic blog, framing everything in theoretical terms that his colleagues would find acceptably scholarly. That night, alone in his hotel room, he practiced meditation techniques he'd been taught, visualizing the 7 points of contact between worlds and reinforcing them with his attention. When he finished, he opened his eyes to find the miniature prayer was spinning slowly on the nightstand where he'd placed it. He hadn't touched it. Heart racing, Tashi picked it up. It was warm to the touch and continued to rotate even in his open palm, like a compass needle seeking north. Something was near. He moved to the window. Prayer wheel extended. The spinning increased in speed as he pointed it toward the street below. Focusing his vision as he'd been taught, he let his perception shift slightly sideways. And there it was. A figure stood beneath a streetlight, looking up at his window. It appeared human at first glance, but its proportions were subtly wrong. Its limbs too long and fluid, as if its bones weren't quite solid. Its face was hidden in shadow, despite the streetlight directly above it. Tashi's first instinct was to back away from the window, to pretend he hadn't seen it. But that wasn't what he'd been trained for. The keeper's voices echoed in his memory. Observe first, identify, then decide whether to engage or reinforce barriers. He kept his breathing steady as he studied the entity. It made no threatening moves, simply stood watching his window with an unnerving stillness. The prayer wheel in his hand spun faster, but didn't grow hot, a sign that while this was definitely not human, it wasn't necessarily dangerous. After several minutes, the figure raised what might have been a hand in a gesture that seemed almost like a salute. Then it turned and walked away, its gait too smooth, as if it were gliding rather than stepping. When it passed beyond the circle of streetlight, it didn't emerge on the other side. Tashi waited until the prayer was slowed to a stop before exhaling. His first encounter outside the monastery's protection, and he'd handled it without panic. Progress. He slept fitfully that night, dreaming of spinning wheels and faceless monks. In the morning, he recorded the encounter in the journal Rinchen had given him, noting every detail he could remember. This was part of his training now, to document, to build a personal archive of knowledge that would eventually be shared with future keepers. When he finally boarded his flight back to San Francisco, Tashi felt the weight of his dual existence settling onto his shoulders. To his fellow passengers, he was just another traveler, perhaps a student or young professional returning from an exotic vacation. None would guess that in his carry-on bag was a prayer wheel that could detect interdimensional anomalies, or that beneath his ordinary appearance lay the beginning of extraordinary perception. As the plane lifted off, carrying him away from Bhutan, Tashi looked out the window at the receding mountains. Tiger's nest was invisible from this distance, but he could feel its presence like a tether connected to his core. He would return, as promised, but for now, his path led back to his other life, to his dissertation, his tiny apartment, his friends who knew nothing of what he'd become. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Tashi closed his eyes and began his daily meditation, visualizing the 7 points of contact between worlds. Somewhere far below, in a cavern beneath an ancient monastery, the great prayer wheels continued their endless spinning, maintaining the delicate balance between realities that most humans would never know existed. And in San Francisco, something was waiting for him. He could feel it already, a ripple in the fabric of the ordinary world, a door beginning to open where no door should be. His training had only just begun, but the work of a keeper never waited for readiness. Tashi Wangchuk, grandson of a runaway guardian, PhD candidate in anthropology, and newest initiate of the Black Hat lineage, was going home to face his destiny. 3 weeks later, the coffee shop on Valencia Street hummed with the familiar sounds of espresso machines and indie music. Tashi sat in the corner, his laptop open to his dissertation draft, though his attention was on the door. "Sorry I'm late," said Decky, sliding into the seat across from him. Her presence in San Francisco still surprised him, though she'd explained that spotters often travel where they were needed. "How was Chicago?" he asked. "Cold. Busy. 3 minor anomalies and one that almost breached fully." She stirred sugar into her latte. "They're growing more frequent." Tashi nodded grimly. He'd encountered several himself in the past weeks. A shadow person on a BART platform that only he could see, a section of Golden Gate Park where time seemed to run at the wrong speed, a stranger at a party whose reflection showed a completely different face. Rinchen believes it's because your grandfather's absence left the San Francisco Nexus unguarded for too long, Decky continued. The barrier's thinned. Now they need active reinforcement. I'm doing what I can, Tashi said, but my training's barely started. I don't know if I'm ready for a full breach. Decky's eyes met his. That's why I'm here. The senior keeper sent me to help until you completed your next training period. A notification pinged on Tashi's phone, a reminder of his departmental meeting in an hour. The ordinary world demanding his attention as it always did. How do you balance it? He asked. Being a spotter and having a normal life? Decky smiled. Who says I have a normal life? She reached across the table and tapped his laptop screen. Finish your dissertation, Tashi. Defend it brilliantly. Then return a tiger's nest for your next phase of training. The worlds have existed in balance for millennia. They can handle a few more months of your divided attention. Tashi wasn't so sure, but he nodded anyway. As they gathered their things to leave, his miniature prayer wheel, hidden in an inner pocket of his jacket, began to spin. Both of them froze, instantly alert. Decky's hand moved to her own pocket, where Tashi knew she carried protection amulets similar to his. Where? She whispered. Tashi closed his eyes briefly, extending his senses as he'd been taught. Outside, moving east. They paid quickly and followed the spinning wheel's guidance, walking casually but purposefully down Valencia Street. The wheel spun faster as they approached a narrow alley between buildings. There, Decky murmured, nodding toward shimmering air at the alley's darkest point. To ordinary eyes, it might have looked like heat rising from asphalt, but Tashi could now see it for what it was, a thinning between worlds, a potential doorway forming where none should exist. What do we do? He asked, suddenly very aware of his limited training. Decky handed him a small pouch of herbs and minerals. Focus on the center of the disturbance. Visualize the 7 points sealing it shut. I'll establish the perimeter. As Tashi approached the shimmer, the sounds of the city seemed to fade. The air grew colder, and he could hear just faintly the now familiar clicking of prayer wheels from somewhere beyond the thinning barrier. He thought of the great cavern beneath Tiger's Nest, of the keepers with their centuries of knowledge, of his grandfather who had run from this responsibility, and he thought of all the ordinary people walking the streets around him, oblivious to the fragile membranes separating their reality from others less benign. Drawing on his training, Tashi began the sealing ritual, his hands moving in precise patterns as he visualized the boundaries strengthening. The shimmer resisted at first, pulsing like a heartbeat, but gradually it began to fade. From the corner of his eye, he saw Decky moving around them, ensuring no ordinary citizens wandered too close. She was good at this, making the extraordinary invisible in plain sight. As the last of the shimmer dissolved, Tashi felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. Maintaining barriers between worlds drained energy in a way he was still learning to manage. Well done, Decky said, returning to his side. The first of many, I suspect. Tashi nodded, looking around the busy street, at people shopping, talking on phones, going about their days in blissful ignorance of what had nearly happened in this unremarkable alley. Do you ever wish you didn't know? He asked quietly. About all of this? Decky considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but then I remember what's at stake. Balance isn't just about keeping dangerous things out. It's about preserving the integrity of each reality, including this one. She gestured at the vibrant cityscape around them. Worth protecting, don't you? Tashi thought about his life before Tiger's Nest. The comfortable certainties, the bounded horizons, and he thought about the vastness he now glimpsed beyond those horizons. Terrors, yes, but wonders too. Yeah, he said finally, worth protecting. His phone buzzed with another reminder. The departmental meeting was in 20 minutes. Ordinary life. Call him back. Go, Decky said, as if reading his thoughts. Be Dr. Wongchuk for a few hours. I'll keep watch. As Tashi hurried toward campus, the prayer wheel in his pocket gradually stilled. But he knew it would spin again soon. The barriers were thinning. The world were drawing closer, and he was only beginning to understand his role in keeping them apart. In the distance, he could almost hear the great prayer wheels of tigers nest turning, an echo across continents, a call he would answer again and again for the rest of his life. For now, though, he had a dissertation to defend, one world at a time. The end.